Well, how are we today? All in our places with sunshiny faces. Last time I probably sounded like I was coming down too hard on modern educated people, emphasizing how that we have lost our poetic imagination and we're only able to deal with prose. Of course, that's a generalization, but it's still one that I don't take back because that's part of the problem that we're having in education, not only with the study of the Bible, but literature of similar types. That's the reason why usually the study of this kind of literature goes under the honors program or some other kind of special program of literature, because it's hard to get people interested in studying this kind of literature. But the fact of the matter is that that there are millions of people in the United States who don't want to study that kind of literature, but who do prize the Bible very highly. And so our problem then is to try to get people into a way of studying it, or a way of reading it, that will actually produce better results. And so I'm going to review a little bit what we did last time on the poetic imagination and the symbolic imagination that it requires to study Genesis. And that came from our chapter in the meaning of creation called A Monotheistic Universe, part of it. And that chapter begins with a quote from Deuteronomy, which has to do with what is the nature of idolatry, what is the nature of the problem of humanity from the perspective of the Bible. Genesis is not dealing with scientific questions, but with the basic existential problem with humanity. That is, we are natural idolaters. We don't look any higher than nature or the world in which we live for our ultimate meaning. In order to look above, even in order to understand nature, you have to have symbolic imagination, because a theoretical physicist is talking almost totally in symbolic terms. And there's certainly no way to be a good scientist, at least a theoretical scientist or a philosopher of science, without having a good symbolic imagination. But you can be a practicing scientist and not have much symbolic imagination. And many times, scientists who have good symbolic imagination when they're dealing with their own field, all of a sudden turn complete literalist when they're dealing with something in a more poetic genre, or when they're dealing with the Bible. This passage from Deuteronomy: "Beware lest you lift your eyes to heaven. When you see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the host of heaven, you be drawn away, and worship them and serve them, things which the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the heaven." Idolatry is simply not, from the perspective of Deuteronomy and from the perspective of the New Testament, particularly Paul in the book of Romans, if you want to read the first couple of chapters. Idolatry simply consists in not looking high enough. You're looking around and you're seeing everything that is around you, but you're not looking high enough to find the ultimate source or the ultimate power behind everything that you're looking at, and so you actually focus on and worship the things that you're looking at. In other words, you focus on nature. And so idolatry, or polytheism, or paganism, which are other words for what the Hebrews would call idolatry. Idolatry is the most natural religion of human beings, and it's a religion that basically stops with nature. But even mythologies take a tremendous amount of poetic imagination to read and understand. And so if the Bible is an anti-mythology, or if the Bible is trying to substitute different symbolic language for what mythologies provide a language, then you have to have at least a similar kind of symbolic imagination in order to read it or to hear it. It was originally meant to be heard. There is no way to talk about God except in symbolic language. That's almost a quote from Paul Tillich, and I'll have another quote from him later on. But we talked about the awkwardness of literalism. The universe, how the universe is conceptually organized. How the universe is conceptually organized is immaterial to the concerns of Genesis. And you remember the example that Hires used for that. The tribe in New Guinea that has a cockatoo universe. The universe is divided into red cockatoo and white cockatoo. And from the perspective, what Hires is trying to say is, Genesis can mean the same thing to someone who has a red cockatoo, white cockatoo universe as it can for a person who has a Ptolemaic universe, or somebody who has a Copernican universe, or an Einstein universe. It doesn't make any difference how the universe is conceptually organized. Genesis says the same thing to it. What does it say to it? Whatever there is in the red cockatoo part of the universe is absolutely dependent upon God. It's the creation of God. Whatever there is in the Ptolemaic universe is absolutely dependent upon God. It's creature. It's not creator, it's not divine, it's not God. Whatever exists in the Copernican universe, and these are different conceptions, Genesis says exactly the same thing to them. So Genesis is not trying to either change or modify anybody's scientific view of the universe. Genesis is speaking to whatever scientific view of the universe might exist. A literal reading, for instance, of the word firmament is a good example from the book of Genesis, which would require some very peculiar additions to both scientific and religious belief. Firmament is a solid thing. You know, I don't know whether you'd better picture it as a kind of a metallic dome, or maybe a plexiglass dome, since we do more of this stuff with plexiglass these days. But nobody in the Copernican universe, or the Copernican conceptuality of the universe, believes that there is a literal metallic or plexiglass dome to which the stars and everything are attached. But the fact that Genesis 1 uses the word firmament doesn't change the fact that whatever Genesis says about the firmament, it also says about any other conceptual organization. However the stars are attached, they are the creation of God. However far the stars are out from the earth, they're the creation of God. Whatever they consist of, they're the creation of God. And however the earth moves, it's the creation of God. And so that's what Hires is trying to say about that Genesis is not tied to any particular conception of the universe. If it were, then Genesis would have died as a living document centuries ago, because every time we've changed our conceptuality of the universe, we will have had to have then thrown Genesis out as having any relevance for modern people. And that's exactly what happened in the 18th century of unbelief, is that people who saw Genesis attached to the Ptolemaic view of the universe decided, or the Aristotelian view of the universe, decided, since Genesis is that ancient primitive thing that only applies to ancient views of the universe, then it has no relevance for our understanding today. So a greater difficulty confronting literalism is the impossibility of reconciling even the two accounts of Genesis, of creation in Genesis, because they have different orders of creation. Again, just specific instances. In the first creation account, that is the first one in the book, the first creation account in Genesis chapter 1, vegetation plant life is created before human beings. In the second account, human beings are created before plant life. Human beings are created, and then plant life is created for human beings. And in the first chapter of Genesis, it just says male and female are created together in the image of God. Male and female are created. Adam is created. The word Adam just means human being. So in the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis, Adam almost always means human being. It does not mean a male human being. It means a human being. And then in the second chapter, Adam is created, vegetation is created, and then God notices that the human being is alone. In other words, there are no other human beings to have fellowship and relationship with him. So he says, it's not good for the human being to be alone. I will make a help meet for him. So then he creates the woman, right? Wrong. That may be the way we would tell the story, but that's not the way Genesis tells the story, because again, it has a little bit more poetic imagination. When God notices that human beings do not have proper partners or proper fellowship, then he creates the animals in the search for a helper that is suitable for human beings. And so he passes them by the man. The man names them. But as he names them, he never comes across one that he names that is a proper partner for him. He considers the cow, he passes it up. He considers the sheep, he passes it up. Again, poetic imagination requires a little humor. And a lot of people who read the Bible do not realize how much humor is in the Bible. And this is a kind of a humorous story about the origin of the female. The female is created at the same time the male is created, and both of them are in Adam. But the differentiation between the male and the female only occurs after God and Adam search the created world for a partner that is suitable. And when they do not find a partner that is suitable, then the decision is made to derive a suitable partner from out of the human being himself, because there's nothing else but another human being who can be a suitable partner. So he causes Adam to fall into a deep sleep, and then reaches into Adam, and right from the center of the core of his being brings out a female. So then for the first time, the male and female are differentiated. Well, that's just a different story from chapter 1. And if you're looking for these stories to chronologically agree, then what has been produced in our rational minds? What has been produced is what we call a contradiction. But if you're looking for a contradiction, you need to go to something else besides the kind of literature that you have in Genesis. Because literature of the symbolic imagination is not a contradiction. It is a different way of telling the story so that you will get different ideas from it. So just reconciling the two creation accounts should give us an idea that we need to back off and not get trapped in the literalism, because it's literalism that causes contradictions. It's literalism that causes literature which are ideas which are on two different levels to conflict. Now, if Genesis 1 is a scientific account, then it conflicts. If it's not a scientific account, then you can read both a scientific and the Genesis account and learn something different from each one. Neither one may be true. I keep saying that. Neither one may be true. But because they're different does not mean that either one is false either. We also talked about the demythologizing of nature, which is related to my question of how the Bible actually contributed to the rise of modern science, even though it does not contain any science in it. If one looks at the cosmological alternatives that were prominent in the ancient world, the alternatives that were prominent in the ancient world, that's the context in which you should read Genesis, not the alternatives that are prominent in the 20th century or even in the 18th century. But if you look at the alternatives prominent in the ancient world, one senses immediately that the modern debate over creation and evolution would have seemed very strange, if not unintelligible, to the writers of the readers of Genesis. Now, I don't understand why Hires is so hesitant in that sentence, because I think sociologically, psychologically, intellectually, it could not help but have been totally unintelligible. Not if not unintelligible, it just would have been unintelligible. There is no way for it to have been intelligible. It took more than 2,000 years for us to get to the point where a debate over evolution and Genesis would have had any intelligibility at all. And so that means that for more than 2,000 years, for 2,800 years or however many years it was, 3,800 years or how many years it was, the Bible was still a living document which overcame in its explanatory power all alternatives at the time. It did not overcome the scientific explanatory power because there was no scientific explanation at the time. So that was not its job. That was not what it intended to do. That is not what it did, and it still does not do that. Genesis does not overcome the scientific explanatory power of science because it's doing a different thing. The crucial question in the creation account was polytheism versus monotheism, as we've said. And polytheism is simply not getting your eyes above nature. Monotheism means that you do manage to get your eyes above nature, and you see through nature or beyond nature to the God who is the source of nature and is not the product of nature. So, for us, nature has been demythologized and naturalized in large part. Now he's talking about we who are scientifically minded people. Nature has been demythologized and naturalized. But before we could, and it had to be before we could become scientific people. And it has been naturalized in large part because of this very passage of Scripture. So this passage of Scripture, even though it does not contain science and is not to be amalgamated or synthesized with science, is possibly the most important paragraph in the history of science, because it is the basis upon which modern science could develop. If Genesis is a radical shift, in Genesis a radical shift has taken place from the imagery of procreation to that of creation, from a genealogy of the gods as personifications of nature or as productions of nature, to the genesis of nature itself. In Genesis, the natural order for the first time becomes natural rather than supernatural. Human beings in Genesis, if you read Genesis 2 and read about the creation of human beings, one of the striking differences is that human beings are natural. They are not half natural, half supernatural. They are natural beings. They are not God. They have never been God. They never will be God. But there's nothing wrong with not being God, because after every statement of creation, Genesis says that's good. So it's good not to be God. In other words, you can be good and not be God. Whereas in many mythologies, you and the gods are made out of the same stuff. And in later philosophies such as Neoplatonism and Gnosticism, the only important thing about you is supernature. That is your immortal soul or your spirit or whatever. And so in that sense, Genesis is naturalizing not only creation, but naturalizing the human being. The human being is made in Genesis 1 in Genesis 2 out of what? Human being is made out of dirt. God is not made out of dirt. The human being is made out of is raised up out of the chaos, out of the watery chaos. God does not arise out of the watery chaos. Human beings can only rise out of the watery chaos. Human beings can only arise from the dirt because God is already outside and is able to bring this about. So nature has been radically demythologized and de-divinized. Now, another important aspect of what Genesis does is that it sets the stage for our understanding of history, our modern understanding of history. Since almost every other, not just almost, but every other mythology deals with reality in a cyclical fashion. In fact, all polytheistic worship is worship that is geared to a cyclical view of nature and of reality. And for the first time in Genesis, you set the stage for. It's not set for the first time in Genesis. Genesis just basically ratifies the concept of history that the Jews already had before Genesis 1 was written. But the Jew, or the Israelites, had the concept of history being linear, having a beginning, having an end. Every individual event in between the beginning and the end is a unique event that has never happened before, never will happen again the same way. That means that every individual human being is a unique event. Human beings were not immortal souls waiting somewhere to fall down and get trapped in a body. Human beings were not little babies with wings sitting on a shelf. And God comes along and says, okay, you're going to be born this time. That view is compatible with the view of reincarnation, but it's not a view which is compatible with creation. Because in creation, human beings begin when they are conceived. They exist from the biblical perspective. They already exist in the mind of God. But they do not exist as human beings before they are created. And so their creation your creation from the biblical perspective is an exceedingly important event. You would not exist without it. You are absolutely dependent upon it. But your creation is a creation that is, you're a creature, that means you're a part of nature itself. And so the absolute barrier between God and nature becomes also an absolute barrier between human beings and nature in terms of nature. Now, human beings may have a relationship to God, and as a matter of fact, that's what Genesis says, that God has created human beings and given them the image of God, which does not mean that they look like God. It means that there's something about the human being that is patterned after the personality and the character of God. And that is what gives human beings and God the ability to relate to each other the way God cannot relate to a rock. In other words, sometimes we say, well, God can do anything. But the problem is, as long as a rock is a rock, God cannot relate to a rock like he does a human being. That whole idea that God can do anything is a philosophical idea that doesn't have much use in interpreting the New Testament. Because in the New Testament, God may theoretically be able to do everything, but he doesn't do everything. He does things in a certain way so that human beings will be human beings and not gods, and they won't be rocks. They'll be beings with personality who are capable of thought, but that's not the most important thing in a human being. They're also capable of love and relationship. In other words, being a saved or a good person in the Bible is not dependent on your IQ. That's very important, and we all like to have as high an IQ as we can. But your relationship to God is not dependent on your IQ. Your relationship to God is dependent upon the image of God that's in you. And someone with a extremely low IQ still has the image of God. And the reason why they have an extremely low IQ is because they are more closely related to nature than the immortal souls of Plato or the immortal souls of the Gnostics. So nature is the context in which human beings develop. So nature will have something to do with what human beings look like, what human beings are made of, how human beings' brains operate, and how they sometimes fail to operate. Nature, that we're natural, we're nature. And so that's very important in the biblical perspective. And so myths tend to legitimize and participate in cyclical time. But the Hebrew story participates in linear time, which is the basis for history, the concept of history. God creates history at the same time he creates human beings. You know, sometimes we talk about prehistorical, or we talk about primeval history. But what we mean by history in the modern sense is intimately connected with human beings. God creates time along with human beings. And everything lives within time, but only human beings understand what time is. And everything lives within history, but only human beings write history. So history largely is about, in the history in the Bible is largely about the relationship between God and human beings. And that's the reason why every book in the Bible, except one, there's one book in the Bible that doesn't mention God, just like Laplace. And that's the book of Esther. But God is assumed, of course, in the book of Esther. So there are some history books these days who think they can write the history of the United States without mentioning God, except in a couple of instances. But the Bible didn't have that view. They understood that human beings and history and time are absolutely dependent upon God. So the creation account, therefore, is not science and history, but the basis for science and history. And wherever the creation account has not been the primary document of a culture, they have a different view of science and history. That may be merely a coincidence. I'm arguing that it's not merely a coincidence. It is a coincidence, but not merely a coincidence. We use that word merely quite a bit these days, as we're going to see in a quotation from Tillich in just a minute. So the temptation to idolatry is universal. And from the biblical perspective, even people who have become Jews and Christians have not escaped the temptation to idolatry. Because the temptation to idolatry is the temptation to count anything that is not God as divine or as in the place of God. I did this thing on idolatry the other day at a church for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. And if you think it's hard to teach college kids, try to teach 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. But my daughter called me last night and said that my granddaughter had gotten the message, and she's 5 years old. She explained to her, she has a boyfriend named Jake. You know, you can't, it's incredible. The changes in human hormones in the last few decades. Anyway, she has a boyfriend named Jake, but she explained to my daughter on the way home the other night, Mommy, I like Jake, but I like God better because I don't want Jake to be God. So, you know, I was successful. I don't know whether I'm going to be as successful in this course or not, but I was successful with my granddaughter. If one wishes to explore comparisons and approximations, what Genesis 1 most closely parallels is not a modern natural history, but the pattern of the 7-tablet Babylonian cosmology. 7 days, 7 tablets. Without its gods and goddesses, myths and monsters. If Genesis had included gods and goddesses, myths and monsters, what would have been its use? It would have been simply another repetition, maybe in a slightly different form, of the Babylonian mythology. Its use, the reason why it is still a living option in the world today, is because it demythologized the Babylonian tablets. It got rid of the gods and goddesses, myths and monsters. And we went over the 7 tablets, and we'll just do them very quickly and see how they correspond to the 7 days. The divine spirit and the cosmic matter are coexistent and co-eternal. In other words, everything comes out of cosmic matter. Whereas in Genesis, the divine spirit creates cosmic matter, so it does not come out of cosmic matter. Cosmic matter is the creation, and it exists independently of the divine spirit. The primeval chaos, Tiamat, is enveloped in darkness, whereas the earth is a desolate waste with darkness covering the deep. Now the thing actually says darkness covers the deep, which is not a bad translation, but it's really darkness covers the deep. The earth is a desolate waste with darkness covering the deep. So there is a parallel. There is a parallel. But the parallel is, where is God? Where are the gods in the Babylonian thing? They are still within Tiamat. They have yet to be procreated. But where is God in Genesis? He is the one who has created the desolate waste. And he's beginning to now look it over so that he can work it up and build it up into an orderly creation. Light emanates from the gods in the Babylonian myth, but light is created in the Genesis myth. By the way, that is a good way to get at this point of the symbolic imagination also, because in a great many naturalistic theologies, including some modern New Age theology, God is sometimes spoken of univocally as if God were light. Well, in the Bible also speaks of God as light, but not univocally. God is light in the sense of the light that we experience analogically or symbolically. The light that we experience is a creature. It's not the creator. Now, it has a great deal of power. Without the light that we experience, our lives could not exist. But that doesn't mean that the light that we experience is the creator. It means that the creator has provided the light through his creation in order that we might continue to exist. That's the biblical perspective. And then you have the creation of the dry land and the creation of the firmament. Now that is different, and we've already talked about the meaning of firmament. Then on the same day, you have the creation of the luminaries, that is the sun and the moon, in both the Babylonian and the Genesis account. And then on the same day, and the same tablet, you have the creation of man and the creation of man in both accounts. And then on the seventh day and in the 7th tablet, the gods rest and celebrate. God rests and sanctifies the 7th day. And then we looked at the chapter on a work without handles, talking about the symbolic imagination. This is where I came down on modern people. One of the more dubious successes, and since I'm a modern person, I'm coming down on myself as well. One of the more dubious successes of modern science and its attendant spirits, technology, historiography, and mathematics, is the suffusion of intellectual life with a prosaic and pedantic mindset. Poetry is turned into prose, truth into statistics, understanding into facts, education into note-taking, art into criticism, symbols into signs, faith into beliefs. One of the frustrations of a teacher, at least a teacher in literature or in the Bible or things like this, is that he knows or she knows when she gets up in front of a class that for many students, the only important thing is getting ready for an exam. You know, and that's not the important thing for me. I have to give exams because if I don't give exams, then they'll probably fire me. But the most important thing for me is not giving exams. The most important thing for me is to try to fire something of the imagination or the symbolic imagination, and to get a picture of the nature of reality that the work of literature is trying to present. Now, depending on the literature, it may be a different picture of the nature of reality. For instance, when I try to explain Neoplatonism, it's not because I'm a Neoplatonist, but I try very hard to get you to understand imaginatively the picture of reality that Plato has. Because if you don't understand that, then you can't contrast it or compare it, for instance, with the biblical perspective, or with the Hindu perspective, or anybody else's perspective. Poetry is turned into prose. This can be readily seen, for instance, in some students when they first get into a subject matter, like get into science. Use your imagination and try to imagine a family gathered around a young infant that's just been born. And the grandmother is there, maybe even the great-grandmother is there. We got a lot more great-grandmothers now than we used to. But great-grandmother is just ecstatic over this birth of this infant. And so with the family gathered around, she says something which is actually a doxology, that is a statement of praise. Oh, hasn't God given us a wonderful little child? Meanwhile, there's a sophomore science major who's her great-grandson. And he has just learned the scientific perspective, or he's been imbibing the scientific perspective. So he says what? He says, oh, great-grandma, that's a stupid thing to say. You know how that child got born. Two people had sex. Semen was deposited. It somehow got connected with an egg. And then a zygote was formed, and then an embryo developed. And 9 months later, poof, out it came. Now, what's the difference in what that sophomore science major said and what great-grandma said? The major difference is that great-grandma can think in wider terms than the science major. She can think on two different levels, because the sophomore is kind of stupid if he thinks that great-grandmother does not know where babies come from. She's just not commenting on the sexual activity that produces babies. She knows it. But great-grandmothers usually don't comment on it. I mean, more of them are learning to do that these days, but that's not what she's saying. Now, the fact of the matter is that both of those statements may be true, or both of those statements may be untrue, but they're not in contradiction. They're different ways of talking about something. G.K. Chesterton one time gave he was another person who was very concerned about the loss of poetic imagination, and he wrote in the 20s and 30s, The Loss of Poetic Imagination. And he said, some people know a great deal about the solar system, and so they can explain to you how the sun rises. And this sophomore science major could probably explain to you how the sun rises. That is, the earth, you know, turns upon its axis. And sometimes people can be very condescending, you know, sophomores can be very condescending in explaining to other people what they've learned. The earth turns upon its axis. And the earth turns upon its axis, makes a round every 24 hours. And at some point in the turning upon its axis, the horizon begins to display the sun, because the sun is standing still, and so the turning of the earth displays the sun on the horizon. And that's what a sunrise is. Or Chesterton can say, God said, "Sun, get up," and it got up. Now Chesterton's point is, which one of those is a true statement? Well, again, what he says is, both of them can be true, both of them can be false. One of them can be true and one of them can be false, but they're not in contradiction. There are two ways of talking about things. One is in a prosaic way, and one in a more poetic or imaginative way. So the real issue in what symbolic usages are employed by the biblical authors themselves, and what symbolic readings best represent their understanding. Their understanding. In other words, if we try to make them represent our understanding of things, then that's what biblical scholars call eisegesis. You know, there are two kinds of reading the Bible, two kinds of studying the Bible. Exegesis, E-X-E-G-E-S-I-S, exegesis. And then there is eisegesis. And the difference between the meaning of those words has to do with its prefix. Ex means what? Out of. So this means to read something out of a text. Eisegesis means what? Eis means into. So eisegesis means to read something into a text. And so fundamentalist Christians and fundamentalist atheists who read modern science into the text are doing eisegesis rather than exegesis. So what we need to do is try to find out what the symbolic meanings that were intended by the original writers before we can read the text. As Paul Tillich frequently laments, I've mentioned Paul several times, symbolic meaning in the modern world of hard facts and solid data commonly gets translated as merely symbolic. Now, I told you that I met Paul Tillich one time and heard him live, and almost any occasion he had, he would mention the phrase merely symbolic, because this was at the end of the height of logical positivism and other kinds of positivisms, and he hated the expression merely symbolic. What in the world can merely symbolic mean? Well, it means that symbolism is not as important a vehicle of truth as facts or prose. And so he said, there's no way for a symbol to be merely. If a symbol does not point to some reality beyond itself, then it's not a valid symbol. But if it's a valid symbol, it's a valid symbol because it points to something beyond itself. So the symbol God, or the symbol God as Father, is that a mere symbol? No, that's the only way you can talk about that. So what's mere about it? So the problem, he says, the real difficulty is the opposite. Merely literal. That's the real problem, when people read something and they read it merely literally. Because when they if it's a symbol, or if it's a myth, or if it's some other kind of imaginative literature, if it's a fable, what happens to a work of literature when it's merely read literally? It is totally destroyed. Its meaning cannot be fathomed. Think of any fable that you've learned and imagine how it can maintain its meaning, how the meaning can survive if you read the fable literally. Now, as I said, G-Ernest Wright and a lot of scholars go so far as to say that the God of Israel has no mythology. The religion of Israel suddenly appears in history, breaking radically with the mythopoeic approach to reality. Well, as I also indicated, that is true in one sense. It may not be true in the other sense. How is it true? It's true in the sense that Genesis is a demythologizing document. That is, it does leave out the gods and the goddesses and the monsters and so forth. And so in that sense, it is an anti-mythological document. But in the other sense of myth, that is, if you use myth to simply mean non-prosaic, symbolic ways of talking about God, then you can, and some scholars do use, some theologians do use the word myth to refer to Genesis. But even if you don't use myth to refer to Genesis, if you look through the Bible, you will find mythical elements. Even the most conservative biblical scholars know that there are mythical elements in the Bible. For instance, how can you read the book of Revelation without an understanding of mythical elements? Name some things in the book of Revelation that if you read literally, you've made a mess. How about the dragon? Yeah, the dragon with 7 heads, or the monster beast with 7 heads, but then there's also the great dragon. All kinds of things. I talked last time about cherub. How can you read about cherub in a merely literal fashion and get anything out of it? Somehow your imagination has to go a little bit deeper. And there are still many-headed monsters. And we can talk about we could talk about the Senate being a many-headed monster, and mean something true by it. I'm not going to tell you what it means, but it could mean something true. But if it's read literally, it doesn't mean anything. It's just a useless statement. So if one restricts the term myth to polytheistic materials, biblical materials are not only not mythical, but they are anti-mythical. But the emphasis on myth, the mythic, and the symbolic should not be taken to mean that everything in Genesis is non-historical or without interest in history. Just because some of the stories in Genesis and some of the stories in other parts of the Bible are not history in the modern sense of history does not mean that they don't have some relationship to history. Because history arises out of the biblical view of the world. The concept of history itself arises out of the biblical view of the world. Both the priestly and the Yahwist accounts, and if you've read your Meaning of Creation, you'll be acquainted with what that means. And if you're not acquainted, read your Meaning of Creation. Both priestly and Yahwist accounts of creation are the beginning paragraphs of histories of Israel, which commence with the origins of nature and humanity and move through a kind of universal history to the particular history of Israel. From the biblical perspective, God reveals himself in history. That's his primary vehicle of revelation, is through history. You can find God in nature. You can find his footprints in nature. You can't find God in nature, but you can find his handprints or its footprints. When I see your heavens, the work of your hands, the moon and the stars which you have made, What is a human being that you're mindful of him? That's a psalm. So what the psalmist is saying is you can see the handprints of God, but the handprints are on nature, and so nature is not a primary revelation of God. God reveals himself. Revelation means self-revelation of God. And if God is conceived of as a person, then he reveals himself in a similar way to the way a person reveals him or herself. And revelation is something that occurs all the time. Every day of your life, you receive and give revelations. What do I mean by that? Any of you married? One of the best things could have happened to you, and I don't know whether it did or not, because we don't do much engagement anymore. But one of the best things that could have happened to you before you got married is that you had a pretty extensive engagement. Because what was the engagement period for back in the old days? It was for the purpose of revealing yourself to each other. You know, in order to reveal yourself to someone else, it takes a little time. And it's not going to do any good just to tell somebody about yourself. You know, if somebody asks me what my wife is like, I can say, well, she's 5'7", and she weighs so much, and she's 50-some years old, and she's this percentage of chromium and this percentage of whatever it is she's a percentage of. And what will you think about my answer? If you ask me to tell you about my wife, what would you think about that answer? That I hadn't answered your question. Because when you ask me that question, what you want me to tell you is what my wife has revealed to me about herself over a great period of time. You want me to tell you things like, well, she's a very thoughtful person. She's very sensitive to the pain of animals. That tells you a lot about somebody, doesn't it? But it tells you more about it than how much chrome she's made of. And so what's happened over the years that my wife and I have been married is that we have revealed ourselves to each other. So now we know more about each other than we do anybody else. In fact, we probably know about each other more than we do about ourselves, because we have a hard time really discovering ourselves or revealing ourselves to ourselves. And so one of the advantages of a marriage or a good friendship or any kind of relationship like that is that you reveal yourself to someone else and they're able to help you understand yourself. That's what a good psychotherapist is supposed to do. He's supposed to receive revelations from you. And he's probably not going to take what you say in the first session as sufficient revelation, because you're going to be hiding most of yourself in the first session. All right, if we're going to understand what revelation means in the Bible in its symbolic form, we have to understand what it means in ordinary form. And so when we say God reveals himself, what we're doing is we're using a word which should be understandable in ordinary human relationships to try to describe what kind of relationship God has with his people. He created human beings to have fellowship with them. Fellowship includes revealing oneself to each other. And our concept of God is, of course, that we don't really have to reveal anything to him because he knows us already. But he has to reveal himself to us because we don't know him. And as we're going to see in a minute, any profound theologian realizes that even after revelation, there is a hidden and a known part of God. After revelation, you know something about God. But you also need to understand that most of what God is still hidden. Just like in my revelation to my wife, a great deal of who I am is still hidden. I don't know about you, but there's some things I'm never going to tell my wife about things that I've thought or things that I've done in my past life. It's not because they are all that, because I've told her lots of things that are embarrassing about my life. But there are depths in every person that simply cannot be expressed or revealed. And the same certainly is true of God, not for the same reasons. In other words, God's not going to tell us everything about himself because the same reasons I'm not going to tell you about everything. But one of the reasons why he's not going to tell you about everything about himself is because he can't tell you about everything about himself. We couldn't possibly deal with it, because all we can deal with is what we can appropriate through our symbolic imagination. And so history is the place of God's revelation, according to the Bible. For instance, how do you become a Jew? How did the Israelites become the covenant people of God? They became the covenant people of God through a history. The Ten Commandments begins, I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's a historical event. Now, it may have some legendary aspects of it. You know, that's something you have to decide. But it's still based in some kind of historical event, that God led the people of Israel out of Egypt and brought them to Mount Sinai in order to establish a relationship with them. He already has a relationship with them as creator, but he wants more of a relationship with them. He wants a relationship with them as husband. And so that's the symbol, that's the symbolic imagination that's used in the covenant and in the prophets for the relationship between God and his people. God has a relationship with all people. That's what universal history means. Universal history means that Genesis tells us about the history of all human beings in a short, symbolic way. And Noah is not a Jew. If you ask a Jew whether Noah is a Jew, he will tell you no, Noah is a Gentile. Because a Jew is someone who is involved in the covenant relationship that was established on Mount Sinai. An Israelite is a person who has been involved in that relationship. And in order to be a Jew today, you have to have participated in the Exodus. That's what's happening every Passover. Every Passover, a Jew is participating in the Exodus. God, this is what you did to us. This is what you did for us. This is why we're your people. So that's what we meant when we said that Judaism is a historical faith. It is rooted in history. It's not a philosophical faith. You can't learn to be a Jew by studying philosophy. You can only be a Jew by hearing the stories, the history of God's relationship. And so eventually, universal history in the Bible becomes a particular history, the history of Israel. And so that's the reason why the history of Israel, even though it is not history in the modern sense, is the closest thing to history in the ancient world. Because Judaism is a historical faith. And that's the way God reveals himself, is through history, through a particular people, in a particular language, in a particular culture. So using the word history for all of these materials, that is, all the biblical materials, is misleading if we mean by the term a single, uniform concept of historical construction, such as modern historians might attempt to achieve. But the Genesis account are fundamentally theologies of history. Now, the Babylonian account is not a theology of history, but the Genesis account is a theology of history. In other words, it grounds God's relationship to human beings in history. And they're moral treatises whose materials are collected and arranged to serve these religious purposes. So you tell the story of Genesis, and in a sense that grounds us in the history of God's relationship to human beings. But it's not history in the modern sense of the word. Consequently, it is difficult to make an unequivocal use of the term history. It's impossible to make an unequivocal use of the term history applied to these stories. That's the reason why if you read some scholars who are doing a commentary on Genesis, they will label Genesis 1 to 11 something like primal history or primeval history or prehistory, because it has a relationship to history, but it's not exactly the same thing as modern history writing. It is primeval history. And even science has to do that, because there is no history of Neanderthal man. You can construct something that you might call the history of Neanderthal man, but it's not going to have much information in it, because Neanderthal man wasn't very related to the modern conception of history, and he didn't write any histories. And so even science has to talk about the past in terms of prehistory, even when you're talking about human beings. So it's hard to make this term history apply to these stories, let alone terms such as fact, record, or straightforward narrative. The narrative form is not the message. The religious comment is the message. That's the same with other forms of genre of literature. For instance, Jesus, in a great deal of his teaching, taught in some narrative forms, but these narrative forms are not even called narrative forms. They're called parables, because a parable is a different way of talking than just a straightforward narrative form. And that means that the parable can be true. That is, it can communicate what Jesus wants it to communicate, even if the events in the parable cannot be attributed to any specific actual historical characters. For instance, the parable of the prodigal son may have happened to some historical people, but it's not likely, because the prodigal son acts in a totally different way from the way you would expect a Middle Eastern son to act. That's what makes the parable so outrageous, is that the son acts in a totally different way from the way a Middle Eastern son would act, and the father acts in a totally different way from the way a Middle Eastern father would act. So Jesus didn't tell the story just to tell you about a good man that lived over in Jericho. He's telling you about God. God acts toward his children in a way that no normal Middle Eastern father would act, because he's not going to require his son to be punished and tortured for his rebellion. He, in fact, is going to welcome him back with open arms. He's actually going to allow his son to do something that no Middle Eastern father would allow his son to do, and then he's going to welcome him back as if he hadn't done anything. That's the nature of God, Jesus is saying, even though he doesn't use the word God in the parable. Now, the story of the Good Samaritan could be the story of an actual event. But that's not the primary purpose, is to tell us about an actual event. It's to tell us how a person should act toward a fellow human being, even if he's a Samaritan. He could have told it the opposite. He could have told about a good Jew taking care of a Samaritan, but that wouldn't have near the effect on a Jew that telling about a good Samaritan would have on, because the ordinary Jew could not imagine at this time a Samaritan being good or being a representative of God's grace. So it's not the form that is the message, it's the content or the comment that is the message. One of the many ironies of biblical literalism is that in its consuming passion to be faithful to the Scriptures, it turns attention away from the central religious concerns of the biblical authors and focuses on issues that are largely modern and secular. That's why I use the term modernistic to refer to some very conservative interpretations of the Bible. All interpretation of the Bible should be conservative. But let me tell you what a conservative interpretation of the Bible is. If you run across a fable in the Bible, a conservative interpretation is to treat it as what? A fable. It is not a liberal interpretation to treat it as a fable. It's a conservative interpretation. So if somebody runs across a fable in the Bible and doesn't treat it as a fable, in other words, interprets it in some kind of modernistic way, then that is not being true to the biblical materials. And that is what conservative Christians want to do above everything. And so that's the reason why we need to rethink some of the ways in which we read the Bible, so that we don't really set ourselves up. Because if you interpret a fable in a non-fable way, then what happens when somebody pretty intelligent comes along and knows what a fable is? Well, you have turned him off of studying the Bible or of understanding the Bible. Some liberal interpreters, I've been talking about conservatives, but I've also made the point that there are people on both ends of the spectrum here. Some liberal interpreters tended to agree with the literalists that the simple, literal meaning of these stories was what the authors believed and was a reflection of the childlike simplicity of old belief of the time, which post-Enlightenment moderns, in their great wisdom and sophistication, could no longer accept. C.S. Lewis calls this chronological snobbery. That is, the idea that ancient literature, even medieval literature, is just so primitive and ignorant that we can't learn anything by it. Gaylord Simpson, one of the modern scientific popularizers, in one of his books makes the statement, there is nothing that you should not pay any attention, or you should disregard anything said about the nature of man before 1859. Because from his perspective, the only thing important and the only thing true about the nature of man we've learned from Darwin and from Darwinians. Well, that's kind of hard on Thomas Aquinas and Luther and Calvin and Augustine and Paul and Isaiah. Surely they knew something about human nature that had nothing to do with biology, but had to do with more profound aspects of the human being. Madeline Murray O'Hare, who you may or may not know, used to have a traveling salvation show in which she engaged a minister from North Carolina, and they went around debating each other. And they held one of these debates in Austin one time, and that's the one I'm familiar with. And in this debate, the fundamentalist minister argued that the Bible was literally true was a literal scientific account and a true scientific account. Madeline Murray O'Hare argued that the Bible was a literal scientific account and a false scientific account. And that was the basis of their argument. So basically what had happened is that the biblical interpreter had given it all away to Madeline. In other words, they both believed the same thing about Genesis. So I don't know what they were arguing about, except that one of them thought that it was scientifically true and the other one thought it was scientifically false. And that means that, and for that reason, Madeline would never invite a real Bible scholar or theologian to debate with her, because she in some sense was aware of the fact that there couldn't be a debate there. So she could only get a certain kind of Bible scholar to debate with her. Gunkel, for example, in his influential commentary on Genesis, while defending the poetic beauty and religious profundity of the Genesis sagas, that's the word he used. As I said, the Germans often use the word saga as myth. Though defending the religious profundity of these sagas, often speaks as if they were literally understood by those who told them. And of course, that doesn't give any anything to the original authors. It certainly doesn't account for how these works have had such powerful symbolic effect for almost 3,000 years. The stories and their details are frequently referred to as primitive, naive, childish, infantile, and quite incredible. They are seen as offering explanations of a variety of phenomena that puzzled the ancients. I'm going to try to bring to class, before this class is over, a book that was published in about 1920 by a physician, in which he tells a story of the creation of woman that comes from another culture. And he is just ecstatic about this story that he's found, because from his perspective, it is so much more profound than the naive, primitive, incredible biblical story. But I want to read you that story and see what it is that he calls less primitive, more profound than the biblical story, because that's kind of the mindset. Is that, as I was talking about Joseph Campbell, he was raised Roman Catholic, and he can ecstatically and very hopefully talk about the myths of everybody but his own religion. When he comes to his own religion, he talks about them as if they were a bunch of dummies. Well, how can it be that the only dummies in the world religiously are the Israelites, and that everybody else is profound? That's part of the irony that we're talking about. The naive and the primitive, he says, could hardly be the real content at all. It is at most the miscellaneous content of such stories. The real content is religious, not proto-scientific, sacred, not secular. If anything, science as we know it supersedes magic and those myths which surround magical practices. It doesn't just supersede old things, it supersedes magic and things that are specifically criticized by the biblical text. So often a myth is often spoken of as being the equivalent of superstition, an illusion, a fabrication, even a form of propaganda. So what I'm trying to do in this regard, as I say, I kind of disagree with Hires on how much emphasis he gives on the idea of myth. But what I'm saying is, even if Hires uses myth, it should be understood properly, and that He's not using myth in the sense of that Genesis is an expression of old superstitions or old proto-scientific or old unscientific ideas, but that in fact myth is a very profound way of understanding reality. The only way you can understand ultimate reality is through myth and symbol. It's not an alternative way, it's the only way.